The major successes of the agency, I think, over the years has been in responding to these crises, these international crises, improving its ability to detect diversion of nuclear materials to weapons purposes, in assisting many states with their peaceful nuclear activities. It's got a technical cooperation program which over the years has provided things like X-ray machines and assistance with agriculture and health using radioactive techniques, of course. It has also over the years gradually acquired quite authority in terms of safety standards and now security standards. So when new countries are thinking of getting into the peaceful nuclear field, they look naturally to the agency. It's the agency which has these standards, the only international body which does. And the agency will provide help with states in thinking about a nuclear energy program, whether they should get into it or not. It has a great milestones document which lays out all the tasks that a state should accomplish before it even has its first nuclear reactor. So I think on all those grounds the agency has done extremely well. Where it hasn't done so well is on things that really it wasn't ever intended to or wasn't equipped to, but where we've all come to expect it to be more proficient. So again, you have this problem about high expectations and low provision of funding and facilities. And examples would be, for instance, in being able to detect undeclared facilities and materials, in not being as well prepared as it might be for future developments of nuclear technology, in having a safeguards culture. These are the inspectors I'm talking about now, where a mentality of accounting came into being, where inspectors were no longer curious or were not looking beyond the information they were given. They were simply going in and ticking boxes, is the metaphor used. So over time, international organisations or any organisations tends to become rather self-satisfied with its job, and I think there are certain periods in the agency's history when that has certainly happened. But as I say, it has responded pretty well to crises when these have occurred, which is heartening. Not every organisation can do that. Some simply fade away or collapse, but the agency has managed over the years to respond to this, so that is a good thing. But I also think it's important to be clear about where responsibility lies in this. The agency can only be as good as its member states allow it to be, and in some ways the members are the ones who've been misbehaving on this score. There's much more politicisation in the governing bodies of the agency, the General Conference and the Board of Governors particularly. The case of Iran has really stretched relationship between member states. The United States and Iran are at loggerheads, obviously, over the nuclear weapon issue, and that plays itself out in the agency's own forums, which is not a good thing. Under the Bush administration, there was a lot of pressure on the Director General to do exactly what the United States wanted him to do. That's Mohammed al-Baradei. So relationships really didn't go very well during his tenure. There's a new Director General, of course, so it is hoped that this will be a new era. But member states have to be aware that the agency will need strengthening and reform. It doesn't perform at its optimum level right now, and unless they give those resources to the agency, it's not going to be able to meet the expectations. And Fukushima was an example of very high expectations for the agency that weren't met. People would call Vienna and ask the agency, reporters or members of the general public, what's going on, what should we do, should we evacuate people from Tokyo, what's your response? And often the agency was non-committal. So there was an expectation that the agency is this global governance body, the hub of nuclear security or nuclear safety or non-proliferation, and it not only has to act like that, it has to be able to fulfill these expectations and these promises. So it's the member states ultimately who are responsible for this. The agency, like any organisation, has things within its own powers it could do to strengthen and reform itself, and a lot of that has to do with the way it manages itself internally. So, for instance, it doesn't have the proper systems in place for recruiting, overseeing, counselling, providing career guidance for its staff members, career planning. It doesn't do a very good job of assessing staff performance. All those things could be put in place by the agency itself. It doesn't need its member states to tell it to do that. it could be more transparent in what it does. It has a culture of secrecy, which probably comes from safeguards and the sensitivity of that. And it also stems now from nuclear security, which is also a highly sensitive area. But the agency cannot garner increasing support from the general public or civil society or anyone unless it's more revealing about what it's doing and what its challenges are. So it needs to sell itself better. It needs a better public relations profile, better public diplomacy. Its website, for instance, is fine at the premier and secondary levels, but below that, for a researcher, it's a nightmare. So if you've got researchers who are looking at the agency, hoping to do a flattering report on it, and then you can't access documents or critical information, then that is a problem for the agency's image. There's a famous story about Mohammed Al-Baradei, the Director General, asking various departments in the agency for the number of research reactors, and each department came up with a different number. And I think it dawned on him then, well, the agency itself wasn't doing a very good job in terms of internal transparency and internal cooperativeness, and much less external public relations. So the agency has a transparency problem, it has an internal stovepiping problem. Each of the departments of the agency tend to operate like little separate departments and not cooperate across the board. And that's something for agency management itself. Member states don't have to have anything to do with that. The agency can do that internally. So there are quite a few things the agency could do relatively quickly to bring its performance to a higher level. Longer term, one of the challenges is that it might be asked to do tasks which currently are beyond it. And I'm thinking in terms of nuclear disarmament, for instance. The agency could very well be invited to verify a fissile material cut-off treaty. That is a ban on the use of or the creation of fissile material for weapons purposes. So there'd be a global ban on this, and the IAEA is the obvious body to verify compliance with this treaty. It hasn't convinced enough countries yet that it is the body to do this, so it needs to work on that. It also needs to start considering what happens when it is asked by the Russians or the United States to verify excess stocks from weapons destruction. So as the United States and Russia lower their nuclear arsenals, the idea is that they would bring in the IAEA to help verify that this material had been taken from weapons and would be disposed of and would no longer be available for military purposes. So that's a role the agency has been contemplating. It's been negotiating with the Russians and the US about how this would be done, but there is still not total confidence that this would be achievable. And the main issue here is that in doing this verification work, the agency should not have access to any weapons-related information. You don't want a proliferation initiative or non-proliferation initiative like this leading to proliferation. That is, that the agency itself becomes aware of how to build a nuclear weapon. That's the last thing you want. So these things have to be worked on before the agency will be given the role of verification in these cases. The agency also faces a challenge in monitoring new types of nuclear reactors that come along the pipeline, and some of these are still on the drawing board. We don't even know what they'll look like, but there are successive generations of nuclear power plants that are coming forward. The agency needs to do a lot of work on those as to whether these plants are safe and secure and they can be easily subject to nuclear safeguards. So the idea is that it works with designers to ensure that there's inbuilt safety and security and inbuilt availability to nuclear safeguards. These are big challenges. And in the future also it needs to continually pay attention to the idea that there might be states out there with illicit activities not declared that the agency doesn't know about. This is a relentless, endless problem, because as the typical verification problem is, we don't know what we don't know. It's all very well for states to declare what they have and to trust that declaration and monitor that, but if states don't declare everything they have, or after they've declared they start building new secret facilities, then that's a problem for the agency. So it always has to keep its eyes and ears open for the possibility of another non-compliance case like Iran coming up, and it needs to hone its techniques to be able to do that. That's just an endless challenge, because if you think about it, the agency has to be there forever. If we're serious about getting rid of nuclear weapons ultimately, and winding them down in the meantime and preventing new states acquiring nuclear weapons, then this is an endless job. It's perpetual. So the agency has to have a vision of itself as going forever, basically, and getting better and better. One reason why it needs a strategic plan. It doesn't have a strategic plan. It needs that vision, that constant risk assessment about the wider world to ensure that disaster doesn't befall. The world is safer for having the IAEA, definitely. It's not safe enough, and as I've indicated, the agency does have quite a ways to go to strengthening and reform, and in some ways it's an endless task. It has to always be ahead of those who would misuse nuclear materials for weapons purposes or other destructive purposes. So it's an endless task, and member states, who are ultimately responsible for this, need to provide the agency with the means to make the world safer and safer. So yes, the world is safer because of the agency. It could be safer still, and we need to provide the agency with the means to do that.